It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. How are you?
Good. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. Glad to have as well Pierre Aski, co-founder of the news website Rue 89. His latest book, The Right to Happiness, which is not about Bhutan.
No, it's about France, and that's a big challenge.
And we'll talk about it in part 2, just what the nation's mood is 3 weeks out
3 weeks only, yes.
from the French presidential election. Angela Diffley, reporter and anchor at sister station Radio France International. Nice to see you.
Hello.
And we said 4 Paris-based correspondents. We have a visitor today, Sarah Morris, France 24's Madrid correspondent. How are you?
Very well.
Welcome to the French capital. Yeah.
Thank you.
The World This Week on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag World This Week. Wednesday, I guess what some are calling a red letter day for Europe. The president of the European Council served divorce papers that start the clock on 2 weeks, 2 years of Brexit negotiations. And for all the positive spin, Donald Tusk qualifying the talks to come as a damage control exercise. Sarah, with so many British nationals who live in Spain, what's the mood 9 months after that vote?
Extremely nervous for those British nationals that live in Spain. I think the figures vary between 300,000 to up to 1 million, because there's a lot of people who have summer houses on the costas who visit Spain occasionally. And for some of those people, they're just left in this no man's land. Some of them have sold up all their property in the UK. They have got a pension coming into Spain, and that's all they have to live on. It would be very difficult for some of those people to go back to the UK. And at the moment, they don't know really, they haven't got any guarantees either from the Spanish government or from the British government as to what's going to happen to them. Constant lobbying, I think, being done on all fronts. And the British consul, I know, is very, very worried about some of those people on the costas, particularly the elderly.
And that's at the heart of one of the first skirmishes we've seen, which is leaders on the continent, Germany, France, now the EU, saying, first we have to untangle the current relationship and the status of those British citizens in Europe and European citizens in Britain before we can talk about the future.
That's right. And I think, I've asked the Prime Minister of Spain directly. I've said, would Spain be a key ally in the talks, given all the Brits that are in Spain? That it's the largest community of Brits anywhere in the EU. And his reaction at the moment is to try and say, all the partners, all the EU members negotiate together. Nobody will break ranks and do bilateral talks. But it's clear that it's in some ways in the interests of Spain to make sure that some of those people don't sell up, get forced out of Spain and leave those local economies very badly damaged.
Angela Diffley, how would you characterize it here in France? Because it's a different kind of situation for the expatriates here.
Yes, I think many of them in Spain a lot of them are elderly people as well who are using the public services in Spain, whereas I think in France, I don't know if anybody's done the figures, but there are a lot of people working here as well. What is interesting is that in Britain, there's very little interest in the welfare of the expats. Theresa May has constantly said, no, that is my bargaining chip. The emphasis in Britain when this issue is discussed is much more about Europeans in Britain and whether they will be guaranteed the rights they have at the moment. So that's from Remainers who feel loyalty to Europeans who've settled in Britain and feel very bad about the fact that Britain's withdrawn. But it will be one of these first issues. The European Union has said, let's clear the cash first. Let's look at the EU citizens in Britain and British citizens throughout the European Union. And the third thing is Northern Ireland. And they seem to be those 3 areas that they want cleared up before moving on to the next hurdle.
And what was your feeling? Because Wednesday, we knew the date was coming. This wasn't some great shock. The Wednesday, March 29th, was the day when they handed that letter. The real bargaining hasn't begun. But what was your feeling on Wednesday?
On Wednesday, there was something of a relief, actually, because we've had all this posturing and baying from tabloids in Britain. On Wednesday, there was this rather conciliatory tone, which I think most people agree on. There was it or wasn't it a threat, a veiled threat, linking the idea of Britain's security input being a bargaining chip? They might withdraw cooperation on Interpol. A lot of people said that wasn't really intentional, or if it was only very half-hearted. So mostly it was a very conciliatory tone, that speech from Theresa May and the letter. Today, I think we've already moved on. The European Union have decided where they stand, and it is becoming all too obvious that Britain has an extremely weak negotiating position. 27 members who decide what they want. What happens when Britain says we don't agree with that? Even before talks begin, the European Union have said we do not want a simultaneous trade negotiation. We will do that when we feel we've got to a certain point in the exit negotiations, which are about paying the bills and EU citizens.
Is it that weak a hand, though, Chris Verdicki? It's not in the EU's interest to punish Britain, despite everything that's been said.
Well, there's an elephant in this room, and that's Marine Le Pen. If she wins the elections here in France 3 weeks or 5 weeks from now, then everything we're discussing becomes academic, because she wants to take France out of the European Union and out of the euro.
She wants a referendum, isn't she?
Well, I know all the technicalities. I've been over her platform a million times. But the bottom line is Frexit. That's what she wants. That's what she pushes for. And her line on that is exactly what the Cameron line used to be. We'll negotiate, but then, if we don't get what we want, then we'll leave. But the terms that she's putting on that are much stricter terms than the Tories were putting on it for Brexit. No, she wants to take France out of the European Union. And if that happens, or if that's even in play, then it throws all of these negotiations up in the air.
Absolutely.
But if she doesn't win, which the polls indicate at this stage...
Well, that was the case with Trump, too. So.
But if she doesn't win, there will be incitement for the EU to be tough, because make an easy exit will be an example for others to go the same way. If there's a cost to be paid to leave the EU, then you might think twice about doing it. So there's a very hard balance to be found there.
Mrs. May needs not merely to soften her tone, opines The Economist in the lead editorial, but to lower expectations. The magazine warns against threats of Britain becoming an unregulated Singapore upon Thames. And there you see the front cover of The Negotiator with the image there of Theresa May. Chris Verdicki, what do you think of Theresa May so far?
Well, I think that's a good image of her. I think that's the way she comes across, even when she was, she was famous for kitten heels, I think, at one point. Now it's for boxing gloves. But I think she's coming across as a tough negotiator. She's doing as much as she can with the hand that she's been dealt. The Economist, of course, didn't run that cover in the United States. In the United States, they have a huge hole in a golf course with somebody having dug himself all the way into it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Tailored more to the domestic audience.
Tailored more to
more on that later. There's another person who's got boxing gloves on these days, and that's the First Minister of Scotland, who has officially sent the letter this Friday saying they want a second referendum. In Spain, I bet people are of two minds when it comes to Nicola Sturgeon.
They certainly are. The Spanish government will be wringing their hands and they're in despair, because it was the precedent of the Scottish referendum that meant that the Catalan nationalists up in Barcelona, they'd like a referendum as well. And Spain's philosophy is it's anti-constitutional, and that opens up a can of worms. And of course, the Catalan nationalists have immediately seized on Nicola Sturgeon's potential insinuation that if she couldn't get a deal with Theresa May on holding the referendum, she might do it anyway. And that's exactly what they wanted to hear, because before, all the European leaders always said when they were asked about the Catalan situation, they said there aren't really parallels because the UK government agreed with the Scottish government, and that's not the case in Spain. And so if there is a more messy referendum, that will just give more ammunition for the Catalan nationalists.
At the end of the day, will there be what we call a Brussels fudge, where we can sort all these issues out somehow? Or does Great Britain stand a chance of a breakup?
Well, Brussels can't do very much about the Scotland-United Kingdom issue. That's a big gamble, although it has to be said that amongst those who voted to stay with Britain, many of them obviously wanted to stay in Britain for the security and because they felt that way we can be sure of remaining in the European Union. The European Union had made clear that Scotland would have to reapply if it became independent. Quite a lot of them also voted, those who voted to stay within those who voted to leave the United Kingdom, because they didn't want anyone in control. Brussels, London, anyone. So it's difficult to see how that would pan out. And of course, North Sea oil, they've lost a lot of revenue. Brussels can't do much about that. But I have to say, I did feel on Wednesday a sense of relief that things are moving into the negotiating rooms, away from people like Boris Johnson, to a certain extent Jean-Claude Juncker as well, people who rack up the temperature, Guy Verhofstadt as well. Those, well, we'll hear from more of them later, no doubt. But the calm of the negotiating room with some lawyers, some experts in there, and no British tabloids might help things.
You mentioned Jean-Claude Juncker. There's another precinct weighing in on all this, much to the annoyance of the president of the European Commission.
The newly elected US president was happy that Brexit was taking place. And he's even asked other countries to do the same. If he goes on like this, I'm going to start advocating in favor of the independence of Ohio and Austin, Texas in America.
Yeah.
Yes.
Pierre Haski, your thoughts on this?
That's obviously a bit of a demagogic sentence, but it's tempting, and I think the US should listen to it. You know, it's reflecting the mood in Europe. You know, we're really quite upset to hear the US president advocating, you know, saying the EU is obsolete or whatever. I mean, that's the word he used for NATO, but that's what he thinks about the EU. The choice of ambassador that we don't know if it's going to be confirmed, but the choice of ambassador who is circulating about the EU is someone who has openly advocated the breakup of the EU. So sometimes it's quite refreshing to hear politicians say those kind of things, even if they are definitely not very diplomatic.
Definitely not diplomatic. Speaking of Donald Trump, this week could long be remembered for this.
Silence.
With today's executive action, I am taking historic steps to lift the restrictions on American energy, to reverse government intrusion, and to cancel job-killing regulations.
All right, the rest of the planet slightly aghast about this story on the front page of French left-leaning daily Libération this Friday. When it comes to rolling back the Clean Power Plan, it says this: crime against the planet, should he be put on trial, is how Libération puts it. The decrees signed this week, because there's two schools of thought, Christopher Dickey. There's one that says this is going to really roll back everything that was agreed to at that Paris climate change summit. And others are saying, well, Trump can sign what he wants, but the fact is that the rest of the world understands is already moving beyond, has understood that you need to curb carbon emissions.
Well, I think even Trump believes you need to curb carbon emissions, but he doesn't have any practical way of doing it with what he's proposing. I mean, if we had gone on and continued a bit further with that segment, that clip of Trump, he says, and we're going to have clean coal, really clean coal. Well, everybody'd like to have really clean coal, and they've been trying to do it for years, but they haven't succeeded. What he wants to do is say, what's important to him right now is to say to his constituents, I'm getting your jobs back. But the head of the biggest coal producer in the country has said, that's not going to happen, that's not going to work that way. So this is more of his fantasy politics. Whether it will have a lasting impact on the environment, I'm not sure it will. And I think people should sit back and wait just a little bit to see how this plays out, and frankly, to see how long Trump lasts as an authoritative figure in American politics.
Sarah Morris, are you nervous, or are you taking a wait-and-see attitude like Christopher?
Very similar. I thought it was quite interesting that Gap was among a number of American companies that wrote to Donald Trump and said the Paris agreements were moving in the right direction. And I think that the environmentalists want to use lawyers and want to educate consumers. And I think if consumers start telling clothes companies like Gap that they're worried about sustainability and worried about the amount of emissions that these companies are producing, I think it's going to be very difficult for Trump to not move along with them, particularly when, I think of Inditex, which makes Zara clothes in Spain. They're big competitors to Gap. It's a global market now where regulation is really set at a global level, whether Trump likes it or not in some ways.
Pieraski?
Well, it's interesting to note that Vladimir Putin has chosen today to say the same thing as Trump. Human activity is not responsible for climate change. So you have these two powerful men on earth feel the same way. But China is remaining committed to the Paris Agreement. And so once again, Donald Trump has made a wonderful diplomatic gift to China to take over leadership in a key aspect. China is obviously doing it for its own reasons. It has a disastrous environment situation, and it's found ways to make money with green economy and producing for the green economy. So China is very happy to be seen as an ethical country on this planet, and Donald Trump looks like the villain.
All right, we're going to pick up on China throwing its weight around on what's become a diplomatic row with France. We'll tell you why when we come back in The World This Week.